Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most volatile standoffs on the planet, the India-China border dispute. We're going to break down centuries of complex history, shifting maps, and modern military strategies to figure out exactly what is fueling this incredibly tense conflict. Because honestly, to really grasp this issue, which, by the way, impacts global security, we have to look way past the daily headlines and focus on the hard facts on the ground.
So let's start with a really fascinating paradox straight from our sources. If you look back in time, these two massive, powerful nations didn't even share a touching border. None at all. So how on earth did we end up with today's bloody standoff, with thousands of troops staring each other down in the freezing cold? To figure that out, we're going to trace 6 pivotal eras. We'll hit ancient treaties, lines drawn by the British, the 1962 war in the LAC, the salami slicing strategy, the 2020 Gawan clash, and finally, we'll wrap up with the current reality on the ground.
All right, part 1, ancient treaties.
Centuries ago, the dynamic was totally different because you had the vast Tibetan Empire acting as this massive, natural buffer zone between the Indian subcontinent and the Chinese Empire. But here is where it gets really interesting. Take the 1842 Treaty of Chushul, for example. After a bunch of regional conflicts, local rulers signed this treaty, but crucially, the Emperor of China was also a signatory party to this. By signing, China officially recognized this disputed Aksai-Chin region, which is this huge, high-altitude desert, as part of Ladakh. And Ladakh is today a part of India. So that single historical document is an absolute cornerstone for India's legal claim today. Fast forward a bit, and the 1914 Simla Convention tried to lock in borders with McMahon Line in the east. The British and Tibetans accepted it, but China flat out refused to sign.
Moving into part 2, lines drawn by the British. So the British Empire steps in, and they are terrified of Russian expansion in what was known as the Great Game. You've got these anxious British civil servants trying to create strategic buffers, and honestly, they just created immense geographical chaos. They proposed 2 completely different borders just a few decades apart. First up, you have the Johnson Line in 1855, which puts the entirety of Aksai-Chin within British India. Easy enough, right? But then, wanting to appease China to keep them away from Russia, they proposed the Macartney-MacDonald Line in 1899. This one practically hands chunks of that exact same Aksai-Chin area right back over to China. This inconsistency literally laid the chaotic groundwork for the dispute we see today.
And how did the Chinese Empire respond to these British lines? Well, they completely ignored them. They just put out statements saying the territory has its ancient frontier, and it was needless to establish any other. They basically preferred these vague historical limits over strict Western cartography, which of course left the exact boundaries highly ambiguous.
Which brings us to part 3, the 1962 war, the LAC, and the vanishing buffer. The most massive geographical shift in this whole story happened in 1950. Mao Zedong's forces annexed Tibet. Remember that massive buffer zone we were talking about earlier? Yeah, it vanished almost overnight. Suddenly, the military forces of the newly formed People's Republic of China are sitting directly on India's doorstep. From there, things escalated in 3 incredibly rapid phases. First, without telling India, China quietly builds a 180-kilometer military highway known as G29 right through the disputed Aksai-Chin region to connect their territories. When India finally caught wind of this, they immediately updated their official maps to assert their claim and move troops up. In response, China launched a devastatingly unexpected 2-front war in October 1962, pushing deep into Indian territory before eventually calling a ceasefire.
Now, our sources definitely highlight the highly charged political climate of this era. For instance, Indian diplomacy at the time operated on the slogan, Hindi Chini Bye Bye, meaning Indians and Chinese are brothers. That sentiment is often cited as a reason India was caught so off guard. There are also unverified but widely discussed claims suggesting Indian Prime Minister Nehru passively allowed China to take a permanent UN Security Council seat. We're noting these points objectively, but they really show just how complicated and murky the political backdrop of the 1962 war truly was.
So, the 1962 war ends, but it doesn't end with a neatly signed border agreement. It ends with the LAC, the line of actual control. This is absolutely crucial to grasp. The LAC isn't a border. It's a confusing, physically undefined, zigzagging ceasefire line. It literally just reflects where the troops happen to halt. India claims one line, China claims a totally different line, and the space between their perceptions creates this highly volatile, overlapping buffer zone.
Next up, Part 4, the salami slicing strategy.
Both nations quickly realized the danger of having this completely undefined border, so they actually signed strict peace agreements in 1993 and 1996. The most critical rule in those agreements, a strict prohibition on the use of firearms or explosives within 2 kilometers of the LAC. And this brilliantly explains a bizarre modern paradox. It's exactly why, in the 21st century, 2 modern, nuclear-armed militaries are fighting each other with sticks, stones, and iron rods. They are legally bound by these treaties not to shoot.
Since they couldn't use firearms, China decided to leverage its growing economic power to rapidly build border infrastructure. They started employing a tactic that military analysts call salami slicing. Instead of launching a massive, full-blown invasion, they just slowly inch forward, quietly occupying these tiny, undefended slivers of the buffer zone one at a time. It's a creeping expansion. It's designed to change the facts on the ground without ever triggering the threshold of a full-scale war. And this was especially effective while India's own border infrastructure development was lagging behind due to environmental and political delays.
Which leads us straight into Part 5, the 2020 Galwan clash. The ultimate tipping point arrived when India finally accelerated its own infrastructure. They successfully completed the highly strategic Daulat-Bagaldi road, right near the LAC. This was a real game changer because it allowed Indian troops to deploy much faster. Chinese forces, suddenly seeing their tactical advantage threatened, immediately and aggressively moved to block Indian patrols at multiple points along the border, completely shattering that fragile peace. The standoff escalated at lightning speed. On May 5th, Indian patrols were physically blocked at Pangong So Lake. But the real horror happened on June 15th in the Guan Valley. Under the cover of darkness, when an Indian colonel and his men went out just to verify if Chinese troops had retreated as promised, a brutal, medieval-style melee broke out. They were fighting hand-to-hand with spiked iron clubs. The Chinese forces had even altered the flow of the freezing river to their advantage. 20 Indian soldiers were killed, and reports indicate around 40 Chinese soldiers also lost their lives. It was, without a doubt, the deadliest border clash in decades.
Finally, Part 6, the current border reality. Let's take a step back and look at the stark truth of what the ground actually looks like right now. 26. This number is absolutely vital. All along this disputed buffer zone, there are 65 historically marked patrolling points where Indian and Chinese troops have for a very long time actively patrolled. Out of those 65, India has essentially lost physical access to 26 of them. Because of China's continuous creeping occupation and the creation of these new localized buffer zones after the recent clashes, Indian troops can no longer patrol areas that they once freely accessed. And while political rhetoric in India often claims that not a single inch of land was lost, the actual data tells a totally different story. A senior Indian government official disclosed that roughly 1,000 square kilometers of territory is now functionally under Chinese control following that 2020 standoff. To put that into perspective, the vast majority of it, about 900 square kilometers, is located right in the highly strategic Dupsang Plains. So what does this all mean for the future? With China actively building civilian villages right on the LAC to permanently cement their territorial claims and simultaneously arming Pakistan with advanced tech, experts leave us with a deeply concerning question. Is a coordinated two-front war against India inevitable? It's a sobering thought for sure, and one that makes understanding the history of this border absolutely crucial. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning and keep asking those hard questions.